Hi, this is Gary with MACMOST.com. In this special live episode, I'm going to take a close look at the new pivot table numbers feature. So MACMOST is brought to you thanks to a great group of more than 1,000 supporters. You can go to MACMOST.com/Patreon. There you can read more about the Patreon campaign, join us, and get exclusive content and course discounts. So there's a new feature in Numbers version 11.2. So make sure you've got that. And if you have that, you'll be able to use pivot tables. Pivot tables is something that Numbers users have been dying for years. And it's finally here. And there's a lot you can do with it. It's a really interesting feature. A lot of people are going to be using it coming over from Excel. They use pivot tables there. And now they can finally use them in Numbers. And a lot of people have been using Numbers all along. So it's a very new feature to them. So let's take a look. So here I've got a spreadsheet, just a simple thing here. I am in Numbers version 11.2 and let's say I want to analyze this data. Now I've always said that the best way to have your data in Numbers is in kind of a database format. Don't try to do anything fancy with layout and design or anything like that. You just figure out what your key piece of information is. In this case there's sales here and the fields for sales are the date, the product, and the amount of the sale. And there could be more there, the price and all sorts of other things. But each one of these is like a record in a database. And the database just grows and grows and grows and you can keep adding to it. You can have hundreds or thousands of things in this eventually. So that's great, but how do you look at this? How do you figure out what's going on here? What products are selling the most, right? What's our best sales day? That kind of thing. How do you figure that all out? And you could use charts and you could do functions like you could do sum if to get the sum total of all the banana sales or all the apple sales. You can do count if to get how many times were a group of these products sold and all of that. But pivot tables make it really easy to visualize things, and that's the key here. Pivot tables are a visualization tool. So they're not going to change the data. They're not going to add anything to the data there at all. They're going to let you see things in the data, to figure things out based on the data you've got. So to create a pivot table, all you need to do is select anything in the table that has the data and then click this button here. However, I'm not going to use that button because if you go to Organize, Create Pivot Table, you get the same function as that button here, On New Sheet. But I'm going to use On Current Sheet. Now I could see why you would want a pivot table to be on a new sheet, but if you have it on the current sheet, it's easier for me to demonstrate in a tutorial like this because we can see things side by side. So on current sheet, and it creates this pivot table, and it's an empty pivot table to begin with. So there's nothing in here. But it takes us right to the Organize sidebar, Pivot Options. And this is where we set up the pivot table. So we've got the fields here, and these are the fields from the original table, the one that's linked to this pivot table. And then we could see down below here we've got columns, rows, and values. And they're all empty now, which is why this is empty. So let's go and add something to this. I'm just going to add the product. And if I do that, I already get something very useful. I click Product and it will group the products together. So before, maybe I didn't know, for instance, how many products were there in this. I mean, I see apples, bananas, and oranges. Are there other things? Well, it turns out just those three things. So I can see there are actually 3 items in here. Now let's select something else. Let's say amount. And now we see the amount sum here to the right. So it's actually totaling up all of the bananas, the apples, and the oranges, and we see the sum total. If we look at the sidebar here, we see product in the rows and amount, this amount column here, in the values. So you've got rows here and values. And this is what we get in the table. So this is what happened when we simply checked these things. I could have dragged and dropped these here instead of checking them. But by checking them it basically adds them to the place where they make the most sense. So let's go and change what we have here. We have the amount sum. Maybe that's not what we want. So one of the cool things that we could do is we can click on the I button here and we can see a bunch of stuff. We can see summarize by. So it's going to choose sum automatically. But let's say I want the average. And you can see now I get the average sale. So I can see the average sale of apples is about 60 apples, whereas the average sale of oranges is 45 oranges. That could be very interesting information to me and something that's very hard to get by looking at these numbers. I could look at the count. So how many total sales, forgetting about the amounts. There were 17 sales of apples, 23 sales of oranges. So buyers more frequently buy groups of oranges than they do apples, but they're buying more apples in general. And then you could do things like show as a base value or maybe the percent of the grand total. So let's do that and we could see that 38% of all sales are oranges. Would have been hard to actually figure that out here. Let's do the sum. If we do sums, we can see they're actually pretty evenly divided, right? So the total number that I sell are actually pretty equal. So this is the key thing here. We're visualizing data. We're getting information from this table. We don't have to do anything fancy with the table here. We can just use these pivot tables to kind of extract the information. And while you may actually see this and say, oh, I want this here. I want this to be the thing that I see when I come to this document all the time. Another way to use pivot tables is simply to be altering them all the time and doing exactly what I'm doing now is to be playing around with them, changing all the things, trying to figure stuff out. You know, if I want to increase my sales, maybe I'm just constantly playing around looking at averages, sums, percentages, trying to figure things out, and maybe I'll come up with an insight for my business. Let's go and continue here and let's add date. So I'm going to add date here and it's going to put dates across in columns because that's all it has left. I was already using rows. But that may not be the most useful way to do this. After all, we end up with 12 columns going all the way across, one for each month. If I click here, it's one of the many places where I can swap column and row fields. And now this is a little more useful. Since there's only 3 products, having apples, bananas, and oranges across like that makes more sense. And having the months going down makes more sense as well. Now I'm still in percentages here. Let's go and switch back to base value here so I can see here the grand total for January is 276 items were sold. And I could see there were some apples, there were many more bananas, no oranges in January. So I can visualize this data like this. Now notice how it took the dates, which are actually real dates, and it grouped them together by month. That's incredibly useful and actually difficult to do. Possible but difficult regularly. So it was nice that it did that. But what if we don't exactly want that? Well, here it says rows and it says date and it says YM, year and month. So it's grouping them by year and month. If we actually went to January 2022 here, it would actually be separate from January 2021. I could click I here and then do another group by. So maybe I want to do group by quarter. And it's going to put them together by quarter. Maybe I want to do the actual values and actually have all of the dates there. So I could do that. That might make sense. I can do weeks. So you have a lot that you can do. I can even do months and then it would group all January sales together regardless of the year. So if I had 10 years worth of sales, I could see like how well do my apples sell in January as opposed to May in any year. So it makes sense here to do like maybe like year and month is something that really helps out here. I can then go and try other things to extract information. Let's look at the values here and maybe we'll do percent of grand total so we can see percents here. That actually makes it easier to see that October was my best selling month. And then we could choose other types of things to do. There's lots to do. It really depends on what type of data you've got as to how you're going to use this to kind of extract information. Let me go and take a look at the chat here. No shortcut. Do you mean shortcut to actually create a table? No, there isn't. Under if I select this table here and I go to organize, create pivot table. So on new sheet and on current sheet are menu items. So you can go into system preferences, keyboard, shortcuts, and create keyboard shortcuts for on new sheet, on current sheet. So you have that ability if you want to. And somebody asked if I intended to add pivot tables to my numbers course. So my idea of the course is to learn all the core stuff. And then things like new features, I usually put them in regular videos. I wasn't going to just restrict my pivot tables thing to the course. So I actually did a video last week on using pivot tables. It's the same video I would have done and put it in the course, except everybody can see it. So if you've taken the course, go watch that video, and it kind of adds pivot tables to the course. And it's also available for those that haven't taken the course. All right, let's go and look at another example here. So grade. So let's say completely different situation here. Get away from sales and all that. Let's say you're a teacher. You've given out quizzes throughout the entire semester. You've got certain quizzes on certain subjects on days. You've got your students, and you have their scores compiled. Now, what's nice about doing it like this is you can just record each score just as they come in. They don't even have to be sorted in order. Somebody you get a quiz result. Somebody makes up a quiz or whatever. You can go and add the test name, the date, the student, and the score, and you've got this database here. But this database really doesn't give you information about like which student is doing best in the course or which one is maybe falling behind that needs some help. Which test that you gave out was maybe harder than the rest or easier than the rest. That kind of thing. So you can use pivot tables to do that. So with this table selected, anything in it, let's go and create a pivot table. I'll do it on the current sheet here. And let's add some things to this. So you could do this in a lot of different ways. Let's say we want to focus on students. So I'm going to add student first here. And I can see there are my students. And let's add the scores here. And it's going to give us the sum of their scores, which is not what we want, right? Scores aren't summed. They are averaged. So I get the average there. Now you could format the cells here just like you could in a regular table. So I'm going to double click there just to select these. Actually, I want to make sure I select the footer row there too. And I can go into Format, Cell, and let's do no decimals there. So now I can see that. So the average score there. I could even go and say percentage. And that's not going to be very compatible with pivot tables I see here because pivot tables are already not using decimal places like that. That's interesting. So we could do a custom format. Let's just stick with number now, and I'll just do like that. And we can go back to organize, pivot tables there. So now we can see who's doing best in the class. I can actually sort these. In my example here there are 5 students, but maybe you have 30 students in a class. Maybe it's a college course and there are 300 students. So it would be nice to sort them by average. You can do that. That's what you want to do is we're going to sort the students by the score. So we actually want to click on students here, not scores. We want to sort the students not by name but by score average. And then we want to do that descending. Now we can see finally that Mark and Steve are doing well in the course. And Dawn and Kelly not as good. So we want to, if we want to use the data that way, we can. But let's go and add more stuff to this. Let's, for instance, add the tests. So I'm going to add that, and it's going to add the tests going across like that. So now I can look at a lot of things. Like, for instance, I still have all their scores here for the students, but I can look at the tests themselves and I can see what we've got here. Like, for instance, this test, the average score is much higher than this test by a lot. So I can see here that there are a couple tests here that maybe were a little easier and some tests that were harder for students. So maybe not useful for this class, but maybe I want to think about that. Why is that the case? Look at those tests. Maybe next year or next semester I want to kind of take that into consideration. Maybe it's not the tests themselves. Maybe I need to spend some extra time going over this subject and this subject with the students so they understand it a little bit better. So you could come up with a lot of things like that. You can also easily flip how things are working here in terms of columns and rows. A way to do that is click here. There are actually a bunch of ways. We're going to swap. And now we have the tests going this way and students going that way. If you have 100 students, obviously the students would want to be vertical and the tests across. But you can do either one. And we also had the date. And each test had its own date. So sometimes you may want to think of like, okay, which date would each test? Let's go and add date here. And it's actually going to add it. You can see it's going to add it to rows. So rows are test and date. Let's make the date the first thing. And I don't want to group them by year and month. I want to group them by value. So now each date corresponds to a test. But there's like way too much information here and it's repeating things. So we don't need to show for dates the total rows. And when I remove that, notice now it's a lot neater. It's date, test, and it goes across. It looks like the table before, but now I actually have the date next to the test, which is kind of nice. So you can really massage things to get what you want here in terms of the how these fit into columns, rows, and values. And you can move these around and try different things. You could also add multiple values. So let's do something like let's add. Actually, I'm going to show you multiple values in the next example. Let's go to the next example. I'll check the chat here briefly. Yeah, I'm going to show charts here, how to do charts. I'm going to get to that. Yeah, Joel, I mentioned earlier that I like to use the organize to add this because I can add pivot tables to the same sheet here. If I use this one, it creates a new sheet. That's perfect for what most people need, but for demonstrating things in tutorials, it's really useful to actually put them side by side. Yes, you can make as many tables as you want. So I have this sales pivot table here. I can select this table again and I could go and say organize, create pivot table on current sheet. And you can see I've got 2 pivot tables now. And I could have them showing different things. And I can create 5, 6, 7 pivot tables. So if I like how something looks, I can leave it there, create a new pivot table, and then go and have that arranged in a certain way and say, oh, I like that. I want to keep that too. And then continue to go ahead and add more and more pivot tables on the same sheet, on different sheets, that kind of thing. Yes, so pivot tables are kind of like read-only. They're for visualizing the data. So the data is here. This is how you would edit the data. And then the pivot table shows the results. So going back to here, we had all these sales. Let's say we have a new sale. Let's say on 12, 11, 21, there's more oranges. And to make sure that we can see it, let's say there are going to be 1,000 oranges sold. Huge sale. Now, the table here is read-only. It's pulling from this one. And you actually have to update it. So instead of taking all the processor time of constantly remaining up to date every time something's changed, you actually select the pivot table and you click here. And we're going to see oranges jump, right? We have 1,051 sales of oranges, 12 in the month of December. If I refresh, there we go. It adds those 1,000 in. It's now 2,051. And all the stuff in the chart here, or in the pivot table, updates. So yeah, update the data here and then the pivot table will reflect that. And remember to use this update button here. So let's go into this one for a bit. So this is another sales table and this shows you when you have more complex data how you can use pivot tables in various ways. So I'll go in here and I'll say organize and create pivot table, and again on the current sheet, which the button up here wouldn't allow me to do. And then let's add some things. Let's say, let's focus on salespeople first. So I'm going to focus on the salesperson. Even though the salesperson is the last column here, I'm going to focus on the salesperson. And I'm going to say, let's find out how much each salesperson sold. So I'll do amount. Okay, so now I've got that here. So that's some interesting data right there. I can already tell who has the most sales, who has the least sales. But let's add another element into this. In this chain of stores, I have various stores. There are 5 different stores. The salespeople rotate between them. So let's go and add the stores to it. I'll do that. So now I've got the stores here across the top, the salespeople here, and it's broken down. And I can see, for instance, how many sales did Mark make in the South store. And then I've got the grand total for Mark, but also the grand total for the South store. So at this point I can see that the West and Central stores don't perform as well as the other stores, and the South store performs the best. So lots of information I can get out of this one table. It's the same data here, but it's easy to see this information here. Now let's say I wanted to add another element to this product. Let's look at the different products. I'll select those. Now there are only two different dimensions. There's only horizontal and vertical, rows, columns. We don't have three-dimensional displays. So we have to put this new thing, the product, underneath one of these. So in this case it's under the salesperson. So I could see for Amy all the different products and how she sold in each store. I can also do it the other way. I could take product and I could drag it under columns. And now you can see the columns, they're central, and there's all of the products under central, and there's central total, then east and east total. It probably looks a lot better if I were to click here and go swap column and row fields. And now I could see central, and I could easily collapse central, collapse east. I could actually do Option click and it collapses them all, and then I could expand one. So I could examine the east store. I could look at the sales for the salespeople and for products there and see what's going on and get the grand totals. I can see the east totals here and compare them to the grand total there. So there's a lot that I could do here even beyond those two dimensions. And then I could also, let's go and take away the, let's do store and salesperson. So I'll take away the product. I'll select it here. I'm just going to hit the delete key. So I've got store and salesperson. I've got the grand total. But what if I wanted the averages? So what I would do here is go to values and amount and change to the average. Okay, what if I want averages and the total? I could do that because I can add multiple things in values here. It's a little tricky to do. You have to drag and drop. But let's go, and we already are using amount, but I could drag amount to values and add a second amount. So I have amount average and amount sum. I could change that to whatever I want, but sum is what I want. So now I could see it here for each salesperson, which isn't really what I want. So let's go in, and for salesperson I can, or I'm sorry, for amount average, let's see, it's in here somewhere. There's a way to get rid of these amount average, amount sum. No, I guess not, because I'm actually grouping these together. So I'm thinking of something else. So here I've got amount average and amount sum for each thing, and I've got it over here on the right. So now I can look at things like averages and sums. We can go in here and make this much more readable by going to Format and then No Decimals. So now we can see things like that. So I could see for Amy, her average is 28. Her total was 2065. Mark 29, that. And I could look at each individual thing here and say, okay, for Amy in the North store, here's average and here's sum. So you're not restricted to just having one thing that's a value. You can have multiple values. And in some ways it helps and sometimes it doesn't. You may actually want to do what I showed before and have multiple pivot tables. Have one pivot table that shows averages, one pivot table that shows sums. So there's a lot of different things that you can do here. Let's go and get rid of the average and go back to this. We can do dates, and we can have, okay, the central store, and we have all these dates here arranged by month. Let's go and change it. So dates is first. I'll drag it to the top, and now we have January and then the stores here. I can Option click on that, and now it looks like we just have the months and then the sales for each the salesperson. But I can easily expand to see the stores, which is really handy. And you can actually go deeper than that. I could add product to that as well. So now I can do, here I have the month, then I have the store, and then I have the product. So you can go really deep in here, and I can collapse all of those. And I can decide whether there's a total here or not. So for dates I can have no totals shown. For store I could have no totals shown. And then of course the last item here, product, doesn't have any totals because each one is its own individual thing. So I've eliminated those totals to make this a little bit easier to read here. You can get really detailed and get really lost in the data if you want. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. Let me check the chat here. Can you do fit to table? So let's see. You can definitely shrink these columns here. Let's see if we select multiple here. Let's see. I'm trying to remember. Resize row to fit content. Yep. So, or resize columns in this case since I have columns selected. So we can go to table like that, and everything snaps into place. So you definitely can, and I can see that definitely being very useful for things. Also, another thing I want to show. Let's go back to. Actually, I'll just delete this one here. And another useful thing that you can do with pivot tables is not have that extra dimension. So let's create a pivot table on this sheet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dig down. I want to do store first, and then I'm going to do the salesperson. But I don't want salespeople in the columns. I want them to be in the rows. I'm going to drag to rows. So now I've got every store with salespeople under it. Let's get a value in there. I'm going to do amount, and it will put amounts here on the right. So now I have this handy thing here where I've got, okay, total sales at the central store. Open that up. Now I have total sales for each salesperson. I could add product, and it's going to try to put columns, but maybe I don't want that. Maybe I want to put that under rows. So now I've got this thing where I've got, okay, here's a store, here's a salesperson, and here's for each product and the total for that salesperson. So this is kind of a linear thing. It's like sorting everything and summing it up at the same time. So I can easily just dig down into this, and I could sort this as well. Like maybe I want to sort, let's sort the store here. This is by name ascending. That's right. So let's go and maybe have it sort instead by the total and descending. So I see my top store here, right? And then it digs down. And let's say I want to actually have salespeople. I want them sorted also by amount and descending. So now when I dig down into any store, I'm going to see the top salesperson for that store. And then of course I could actually sort the products too and see the top product for each salesperson. So you end up with this long table that doesn't have the extra dimension, the horizontal dimension of columns. It just has this vertical dimension. But it's still very useful. It's a great way to just dig down and look at the data and get sums, get averages. I could add another thing here. I could add averages here. Let's do that. This is a more useful thing, thing to do with values. I can add the values. I'll add a new thing up here. So I have two amount sums. Let's change the first one to average. And then I've got that. So I can, let's format that better. I'm going to just grab those and I'll do 0. Let's also add another one. And you might think, well, what else could I possibly want to know? I'm going to add another amount sum. And I'm going to leave it at sum. So here I have amount sum, but I'm going to go in here and leave it at sum, but show as percent. I could show as percent of grand total, column total, row total, a lot of different things. I'll just do percent of the grand total here. So now I could see for each store, this one's 23%, West is 16 or almost 17% here, and I see the numbers. I see the averages for each sale, and I can expand a store. I can option click here to close all those, open this up, see each salesperson's thing. I still have them sorted by salesperson, so I see the top salesperson in each one. I mean, this isn't a way to just glance and you see everything or you print it out. This is a way for you to analyze what's going on with your data. And can cells be used in calculations for formulas? Yes, I'm actually going to show that in the next example. And I'm also let's go ahead and show charts. Let's do that first, and then I'm going to show you my last example and I'm going to use formulas in there. So let's get rid of this. I created this extra pivot table. Let's say I have all of this, the sales pivot here. There's products, there's months. Let's make a chart out of it. I could, of course, do all sorts of things to make a chart out of this, but this is more interesting. So I'm going to select the entire table here and I'm going to insert a chart, and I can create, let's just create the simplest kind of chart here. And now I see the data there. Oh yeah, we added that huge sale for oranges. Let's delete that to make our table make much more sense. Delete row. Let's update this. There we go. So we're back to where we were before. Now we have this chart here from this pivot table. So it's going to group our things together. Let's go and expand this. So now we can actually see things, and we could see, there's January sales, February sales, March's. We can see apples, bananas, oranges. This will automatically update with everything that goes on in this table here. So we've got that. You could create a table from other things. If you remember, I originally had this table just showing each salesperson and their total sales. That would make a great pie chart. So you could easily create charts from the pivot table that are more useful than creating charts from the original table. So let's take a look at this example here. So this is something you might typically find people using. You have a freelancer, let's say they're a graphic artist, a graphic designer, and they have clients that come in. Okay, they're going to record on this day. They did some work for client A. It was this much money. There must be a pretty good graphic designer, and this is how much they got paid so far. Right. So every time they get paid, they record it here. Great. So we can create a pivot table from that to do all sorts of things. Let's go and with this selected, I'll organize, create a pivot table there. And let's say clients first, and then we'll use the amount chart so we can see who our biggest client is pretty easily this way. Whereas looking here, it's going to be tough to do. And maybe we can change it to percentages. Right, so let's go to this as percent of grand total, and we could see who the biggest client is if we want. I'll undo that. We can also look at the price paid. So we can add that in, and it's going to add that. It's smart enough to know to add that to the values here. So we've got both the price total and the price paid. So we have that and that. And we can see that, okay, this is how much money we should have made, and this is how much money actually came in because people haven't paid their invoices yet. So what would be really cool is to be able to create an invoice from this. Now, I've done a video in the past on creating invoices, and you can do all sorts of cool tricks to have in one sheet your database like this, and another one you have filters and things that create a nice invoice that show exactly how much somebody owes you and everything. And it's a lot of work. You set it all up, and it's great once you have it set up. But it occurred to me that pivot tables can actually be used for that. It's not a normal use for pivot tables, but let's look at actually doing that. I'm going to delete this pivot table here, and I'm actually going to use this button because I want to create a pivot table of this on a new sheet. And let's say this is going to be for invoices. So what we want first is client. And then we want to have these two price and paid. So this is what they owe us. This is what they paid. Let's also add date here. But instead of having date going across, I'm going to group date with client like this. So we have client A and we have all the dates here. Let's not have them grouped by month. Let's actually have values. So we have all the dates of their invoices. Maybe you send out your invoices with a date on them instead of an invoice number. And you've got all of that. Now we don't need to have a total here. So let's go and get rid of that. Let's say the client A total. We'll click there and say total. No. So we have that. Now when we want to create an invoice, we don't want client A to see what all the other clients have paid us and what they owe us. So we're going to create a filter because pivot tables have filters. So I'm going to add a filter and say add for client, and I'm going to deselect everything and only select client A. So now I've got just client A, and I've got all the dates here, and the prices and what they've paid. And look at that. This is like kind of like an invoice. It really is very close to what I did with a lot more steps to create an invoice for this client. And yes, you can perform functions using these cells. Let's create another table here that's going to have the total amount that they owe us. So I'm going to create a simple table and shrink it down to one cell because I just need that one value. And let's call it total owed or total due or whatever you want. You can put this wherever we want. And we're going to do a formula here and say this amount minus this amount. So it's going to actually go and say, yeah, the work pivot table and C42, D42, and give us the total there. So I can make that bold and bigger and do all that stuff. Put that down here. Create a text, some text here. Invoice, and put that at the top and put a box around it and format things and do all sorts of stuff. You can even do things a little bit different here, like you can't hide a column, I don't think. But you can go and do things like let's take this text here and I'm going to change the text color to figure out whatever the gray is that gray is right there. And I didn't quite get that same gray, but you can kind of hide it like that and then collapse this down or something like that. And then create like a kind of a cute little invoice type of system here. And the great thing is that if I wanted to actually go and produce an invoice for another client, all I would need to do is select the table, go to Organize, change the filter. So I've got this quick filter here, client A, change to client B, and there we go. Change to client C, and there we go. Maybe best to have this at the top or over to the right or something. Really easy way to actually create a filter. I could also filter out all the times that they've paid. So I could do add a filter and say for the paid column, if the number is greater than 0, then get rid of it. Or actually, if it is equal to 0 is probably better. There. If it's equal to 0, then have it there. So we have a total of all this. I could even hide this column somehow, or just leave it there. It's probably what you want in an invoice, right, to show that. So you could, this is a creative use, I thought, of pivot tables. People often ask me, like, I want to have a table that pulls data from this other table. And tables don't pull data in general. They have functions that can reflect the data in another table, but they don't actually like pull data, or you make changes in one table and it doesn't push those changes. You have functions in one table and those functions can actually reflect the data in another table. So pivot tables are kind of go against that. They build themselves based on, in this case, this. So using pivot tables in this way is kind of unorthodox probably. There's probably some like Excel experts watching this that are like, no, you don't use pivot tables for that. But you can. You can do that. And I was able to demonstrate using a formula there as well from these. Unfortunately, you can't put formulas inside of pivot tables. I mean, they're basically like, read only. There's nothing you can do in here. I can't like add a column and go ahead and say, oh, give me the this minus this. Can't really do that. So you can't perform that kind of thing in here. But you do have some ability to like perform that outside of pivot tables. And you can't. The other frustrating things is like I would love to change from grand total to something else. Grand total seems to be a pivot tables thing. Like, I see that in other spreadsheets. They call it grand total and all that. It still would be nice to customize that somehow if there was some way to do it. So anyway, there's some examples. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and make sure that I save this, and I'll upload this and include it with the post at MACMOST.com. When I get that posted later today. So you can download this if you want and check it out. Let's see what's going on in the chat. So yeah, so if you have any questions, you can ask them. They're a great new tool. I would suggest playing around with them if you aren't familiar with pivot tables to see what they might do for you. Certainly, if you are familiar with pivot tables, using them in Excel or Google Sheets or something like that, then it's like anything when you go across platforms. This works differently than on those other apps. So don't expect it to look the same, work the same, have exactly the same features and things you can use in the same way. But certainly experiment. I mean, the way I figured out that you can have multiple values like this was by experimenting. I thought there would be a way that I could click here and say add another value, and then it just took me 10 seconds to figure out, oh, you can drag and drop things here and then have those included, and that's kind of really cool. That you could use that and have these multiple values. So it took some experimentation to do that. I didn't get that from just reading the few lines of documentation that Apple provided here. So it's going to be kind of the same situation here, just taking your time to actually try things out and experiment with pivot tables to get them to do what you want and help you visualize your data. And definitely this is something that has been, people have been asking for this. I get asked this all the time. And in the past I've done videos on how to actually simulate pivot tables using categories. And categories similar to pivot tables. What it doesn't do is allow you to change how it looks this quickly. I mean, by being able to select, deselect, drag and drop, and change how this table works, categories didn't really have that. Categories, you had to think a lot more about how to set things up. You got them set up, and then you're altering your original table to do that. And then you would go back to how the original table looked, and then if you wanted to go back to visualize your data, you had to go and turn the categories back on and go and set things up the way you wanted. Pivot tables allow you to really quickly dig into your data, so I could see why people that like to crunch numbers and like to examine things about all their data, why they love them. So thanks for watching this live stream. I hope you got something out of it. If you're watching later, certainly ask questions here in the comments on YouTube or at MACMOST.com. So until next time, thanks for watching.